Greetings from Cooperstown, New York, site of the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. We're very glad you could join us for the latest in our series of virtual Voices of the Game programs. Today, very special guests, two of them, two giants in the media, broadcasting, and also the writing area as well. We're very glad to have with us Bob Costas and Peter Gammons. And today we'll spend much of our hour talking about one of our new Hall of Fame members, Jim Kaat. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bruce Markison. I work in the Hall of Fame's Education Department, and we're broadcasting live from the Bud Selig Center, which is in the Education Department, located in the Hall of Fame's library. We're going to be talking to Bob and Peter extensively about the career of Jim Kaat, not only as a player, but also as a broadcaster. I want to begin with Bob and just give Bob a short introduction, although he's very well known. Graduate of Syracuse University, not far from here in Cooperstown, has been broadcasting baseball since 1980, earned the Ford C. Frick Award in 2018, an award that, of course, the Hall of Fame is involved with each year. Bob, before we dive into the conversation about Jim Kaat, I wanted to ask you about 2018, winning the Frick Award, being a part of that Hall of Fame weekend. Is there one particular memory from 2018, that Hall of Fame weekend, that still stands out for you today?
Kind of a generalized memory, Bruce. I had more than 30 family and friends who were there at my invitation. And having been to Cooperstown many times before, including on Hall of Fame weekend, I made it clear to them that you don't want to show up just for the ceremony. You want to be here or there a few days before to soak it all in and to have that experience of when you walk into any restaurant, whether it's on Main Street or my favorite spot, Blue Mingo, just outside where the Hall of Fame is. You don't have to have made a plan with anybody. You walk in and here's Ryan Sandberg sitting over there. And here's Jim Rice over there. And here's Ozzie Smith and Eddie Murray and George Brett. And what's really wonderful about it is you can sense the fraternity, and it's very touching. And Peter has had this experience as a writer. When a ball player greets you as hello, Hall of Famer, even though we're in a different wing, and rightly so. We're not in that gallery with the plaques. We don't belong there. We're in our own wing of writers and broadcasters. But even in some sense, to be part of the Hall of Fame and to be a small part of the history of the game that has meant so much to me since I can first remember, since I was a little kid. And then the other part of that experience is same kind of idea on the veranda at the Oda Saga, where Johnny Bench famously calls each new Hall of Famer over to sit with him on the rocking chair overlooking the lake. And the new Hall of Famer, unless he's heard about it from someone else, doesn't quite know what the meaning of this is until Johnny says, I just want you to sit here for 5 minutes. Neither one of us is going to say a word. Think about the journey, the life in the game that has brought you to this point. Look around at the other people that you're now joining in the Hall of Fame for eternity. Think about what that means to you. It may sound corny to people who aren't really invested in the game, but it meant everything to me.
Bob, your Frick Award speech, any more nerve-wracking than what you do normally as a broadcaster?
You know, I wrote a good portion of it, and I ad-libbed another portion of it. And the ad-libbing part came after I'd gotten a few laughs with stories about Bob Uecker and others. And it was pretty comfortable for me. And I looked out, large gathering. A lot of people had flooded into Cooperstown. I think there were 6 ball players the next day on Sunday. And the writers and broadcasters have a separate ceremony on Saturday. But it was a very large crowd there. But I recognized many of the faces as I looked out at the audience. But also what's very, on the one hand, it's a little bit daunting, but for me, it was more affirming. There was some 80 Hall of Famers on that stage behind me.
Wow.
And so many of them, they sit you in the front row, not because you're important, but because it's your year to make a speech. And some of them, kind of patting you on the back or go get them. And after it was over, I remember just randomly, maybe because they were closest to me, Jim Thome and Ricky Henderson both hugged me afterwards. And if if for anything beyond congratulations, I think it was because I tried to make my speech an appreciation of the game and an appreciation of the part that broadcasting plays in the history of the game and in people's memories of the game. I would say that 90% of it was about other people and about the game itself, and only 10% of it was about me. And that 10% was just kind of how I got there and how lucky I am to be part of it. So I guess that maybe through the years, having watched some of the broadcasts and then that day having been reminded of my feelings about the game, it's touching to know that people within the game view you, and I'm sure Peter has had this experience, and then I'll shut up. One of my earliest and most important memories to me, when I started doing the baseball game of the week in the early 80s with Tony Kubek, and you'd hang around the scouts or talk to the managers or players at the batting cage. And when somebody says, "You're a baseball man," that's a high compliment, especially because I did so many other things in my career. But baseball was always the one that mattered the most to me, which is not to diminish the Olympics or the NBA on NBC, which I loved, and all the other things I was lucky enough to do. When somebody says you're a baseball man, we get that this is your game more so than any other. That really resonated with me. And I guess that the audience certainly, and maybe even some of the Hall of Famers themselves, sensed that was my feeling about the game.
Yeah, in many ways, it's the ultimate compliment for someone in baseball. Peter Gammons also with us, also an award winner. He has covered baseball for 50 years, written for the Boston Globe, Sports Illustrated, ESPN, the magazine, has broadcast for ESPN and the MLB Network, authored the book Beyond the Sixth Game, it's a terrific book, came out a number of years ago, and earned the Baseball Writers Association Career Excellence Award back in 2005. Peter, I want to ask you, just as I asked Bob, about that award-winning weekend. What do you remember most about 05, getting up on stage, making the speech, receiving the award? One particular moment that really stands out for you?
I was really lucky because the Writer Award, you still received it the same day on the same stage as the players who went in that year, Ryan Sandberg and Wade Boggs. But I remember being very nervous and thinking, and looking out. I mean, it looks like Woodstock when you look out there at all the crowd. But I had Kirby Puckett and George Brett sitting right behind me. And all during Ryan Sandberg's speech, they were leaning over saying to me, "Peter, just remember, the only thing anyone's going to remember is what you screw up." I mean, they were needling me. And I actually was laughing. And then Theo Epstein had sent me a text saying, "Oh, by the way, we're definitely not trading Manny Ramirez." So I get up to go nervously up to the podium, and some wonderful leather-lunged fan from New England yells out, "Hey, Peter, is Manny going to be traded?" I pulled out my little device. No, actually, I could break this. So he is not being traded. And then all of a sudden, I looked up and just went, "This is one of the great moments of my life." And I just, really, it wasn't that difficult to do that speech because it was from the heart. I mean, I think as I stood there and realized, and I think I used this in my speech. I mean, in the end, it's all about the players. And when it's all about the players, it's very easy to talk about players, not about oneself. And so it was a joy. And at the end of it, there had been many years that had passed since I had talked to Eddie Murray. And it was one of those things that happens. Someone told him that I said something, and Eddie was very private and thought that I had said this. So I'm going down the ramp after following the players, and Eddie is standing in the middle of the ramp. And he walks up to me and gives me a hug, and he said, "This game could make us silly sometimes. Have I been silly?" Or I said, "No, we're here. This is just a great moment for me." and especially for someone I admire so much. So it just is absolutely just for one time in my life have that opportunity. It was one of the greatest days I've ever experienced.
Peter, the reference to Manny Ramirez, this is so typical of you. You're always working. Even when you're in the center of the spotlight, you're supposed to be taking the weekend off. You're still working right up until the moment of your speech.
Well, there are people that were kind enough, not family, people who were just fans who came up there, and that's what I do. I answer questions or whatever, and in some ways it was sort of, that's what I do for a living. I got to do what I do. That's why I'm there. So I got to do what I do, and it was actually funny, and it got a pretty big laughter at the time. But it was really fun just to have that happen, and to have two of my favorite people that I ever covered, George and Kirby, in back of me, needling me, making fun of me the whole time, really did help me immensely.
That's great. Of course, Peter and Bob share a common bond in that they're both very close to the man we're going to be talking about for most of the rest of this program. And that is one of our new Hall of Fame members, Jim Kaat. Jim actually started his career with the Washington Senators in 1959, but then 2 years later, the franchise moved to Minnesota. Jim played with the Twins from 61 to 73. I want to ask you both about the first time that you met Jim, if you remember that occasion. Let's begin with Bob. Do you remember your first encounter with Jim? I know you've broadcast with him in recent years on MLB Network, but I imagine you met him a number of years ago, maybe when he was still playing toward the tail end of his career.
Yeah, he finished up with the St. Louis Cardinals and was part of their team that won the World Series in 1982. So his 24th and 25th years in the major leagues and a quarter-century career were in St. Louis. And at that point, I'm living in St. Louis, and I just started with NBC, but I was still working at KMOX in St. Louis, the longtime flagship of the Cardinals network and home of Harry Carey, Joe Garagiola, and Jack Buck. So baseball was baked into the cake in St. Louis and at the station where I worked. So I happened to cross paths with Jim, and he was always the most affable guy, always happy to converse. And as an icebreaker, here I guess I was like maybe 29 years old, and I looked like I was 15. And as the icebreaker, I mentioned to him a game that I vividly recalled in 1967, a season that Peter vividly recalls, the impossible dream season of the Red Sox, where, and this is a couple of years before they went to divisional play, the last truly great pennant race, because in 68, the Tigers and Cardinals both ran away with it. But in 67, 4 teams came to the last weekend separated by a game. There were all kinds of multiple tie scenarios that were possible before the Red Sox emerged. And the Twins were one of those teams. So every game that went either way had an effect on that pennant race. He is beating the Yankees 1-0 at the old Yankee Stadium in the bottom of the 9th inning. Not a big deal then, or at least not unexpected for him to go all the way. You're not going to go to the bullpen. And Mickey Mantle comes up, and on a 3-1 pitch, he grooves one, not intentionally. Kaat grooves one, and Mantle then, in the flickering twilight of a great career, but still capable occasionally of a tremendous moment, not only homers, he homers over the 457 sign in left center field at the old Yankee Stadium. This is pre-steroids. Balls hardly ever were hit over the 461 sign in straightaway center or 457 in left center. And if they were, half the time it was Mickey Mantle who did it. Okay, so I say to Jim, do you remember that? Of course he remembers it. He remembers the pitch sequence from a Tuesday night game in 1962 that was meaningless. Of course he remembers it. And why did he throw him a fastball on 3-1? Because Elston Howard, who was waiting on deck, actually had hurt him more than Mickey had in recent seasons. And he didn't want to walk Mickey and then have to face Elston Howard. So Mantle homers. It ties the game 1-1. Sure enough, Howard follows with a base hit, and then it starts to rain, and the game is not completed. And so instead of a victory, they have to replay the game and the Twins lost the replayed game, and they lost the pennant by 1 game. So
Wow.
did he remember it? Sure as hell he remembered it. And I guess that started us off on the right track, because it's like, hey, this kid knows something about baseball. And that, along with the fact that Jim was always so friendly with everybody. So we were friends long before we began broadcasting together at the Major League Baseball Network. But now we've been at it for well over a decade, and it's a very comfortable relationship with him in the booth. Not a whole lot of production meetings, not a whole lot of stuff pre-planned. We just sit down and call the game, and our frames of reference overlap enough that if he makes a reference to Rich Rollins, and I have to think, well, maybe somebody who's 25 years old watching this doesn't know who Rich Rollins is, then I quickly and parenthetically toss in third baseman for the Twins team that went to the World Series in 1965. And then Jim continues his story. So there's a good yin and yang there.
It works very naturally, no question. Peter, how about you? Do you remember your first encounter with Jim Kaat?
It was in either 73, I think it must have been 73. He was pitching for the White Sox, and was coming off the great year that Dick Allen had in 72. He wasn't there then, but Allen was the MVP and had the great year. In fact, as Jim told me about 3 weeks ago, as I was writing about the Allen brothers, he reminded me that Nancy Faust used to play Jesus Christ Superstar when Dick Allen came up that year, which was the first walk-up song in baseball history. So Jim knows things like that are wonderful. But I remember talking to him, and I was talking to him in 73 about Allen, because I was fascinated by the guy. And they were very close friends. And he was so terrific. He had a couple of great stories about his defense, his base running. And matter of fact, I told him that I thought Dick Allen was one of the greatest base runners I'd ever seen. And he said, when I tell him that, he's going to love you forever, just because that's what he's most proud of. And this is, I mean, he's been a friend of mine for a long time. And I can explain it one reason. But before that, when Jim was told that he had finally been elected to the Hall of Fame this past winter, the first call he made was to Willa Allen, his widow, to let her know, look, I'm so sorry that Dick didn't make it. It was one vote. That one vote separated the two of us. It was a little different voting procedure this year, but he's going to still make it. And I thought, that's who Jim Kaat is. He calls Willa Allen before he even calls friends, and I thought that was terrific. But in 1988, when one of the smartest men I've ever known in the business, John Walsh, decided to go on a fool's errand and make me a television person, the first sports writer to do this on the desk and in the studio at ESPN. He had 2 years in a row before we went to Baseball Tonight, he decided to help make me comfortable by having a co-pilot. So we did also first year Jim Kaat, second year Joe Torre. That was a good way to break into broadcasting from being an ink-stained wretch. But and Jim, I mean, we had so much fun. I used to do these diamond notes. We'd go down to the Charles River, and Jim and I would talk, standing by the Charles River by the Arthur Fiedler's statue on the Charles River, and it was so much fun that we did the playoffs of the World Series, freezing. We were together for Kirk Gibson's home run, and we were also together, of course, for Oral Hershiser's shutout in Game 2 and freezing. And it seemed like we interviewed Oral Hershiser for about 20 minutes, but it was so tremendous because I had this feeling that Jim was having so much fun with asking the questions about, don't you worry, you pitched so many innings. You had the 59 consecutive innings. You had he comes out of the bullpen against the Mets in New York. And Hershiser was just, who cares? This is the one thing in my life that I'll always remember is this run. And the joy that Jim had taught me, you know what? This is just all going to be fun. I'm going into a great business, and we've been very good friends ever since.
course, Jim Kaat was used to heavy workloads as a pitcher, often pitched over 300 innings, often would pitch a number of times out of the bullpen in between starts in the typical regular season. Bob, one of the things that's so interesting about Kaat, and I think this would be jarring for fans of today's game, we see pitchers today typically take 15, 20, 25, sometimes 30 seconds between pitches. Jim Kaat was the diametrical opposite of that. And I know you remember the pace that he had. It really, if people saw it today, they would be stunned how quickly Jim Kaat worked on the mound.
Yeah, he had several games, Bruce, maybe several understates it, dozens of games in which he pitched where the time of the game was under 2 hours. Baseball wants to throw a parade now if you get an individual game that's under 3 hours. There was one, he must have been with the Phillies, and he hooked up with Randy Jones, then with the Padres, who also worked quickly. And I think the time of the game was like an hour and a half, an hour and 35, something like that. Now, that's attributable in large part to the pace at which Jim worked and the general pace of baseball at that time and the time of commercials between innings. There's a lot of factors besides the pitcher, but the primary factor is the pitcher. How quickly is he set to go? And fielders will tell you that working behind a guy who has pace makes their job a little easier. You're just always on your toes. You're always ready to go. The game has a pace and a rhythm to it. And I sound like a broken record with this because I've said it so many times that most baseball fans have probably heard me say it. Baseball's supposed to have a natural leisurely pace. It's not supposed to have a lethargic pace. And when it has that pace, I think the players, not just the fans, not just people watching on TV, the players appreciate it. And of course, the defense behind him was helped by Jim himself with those 16 gold gloves. And when people vote for gold gloves, maybe they think about specific plays. How well did he field bunts and comebackers? But then there are subtle things that don't show up on errors or even advanced metrics in terms of range. Every shortstop and second baseman with whom Jim Kaat played will tell you that on a throw to second base, you got it right where you want it. Trying to turn a double play. Doesn't seem like a spectacular play. Just a toss to second base, almost like you're playing catch. But where you receive it makes that split second difference in turning the double play or not. So that was part of what he did. He didn't mind pitching on 2 days rest. He didn't mind throwing 300 innings. He threw 180 career complete games. You won't see that many complete games in a season between 30 teams now. But of course, it was a different time.
You think about the pace at which he pitched. It was lightning fast. Is your recollection, Bob, that a lot of hitters got upset with him, tried to call time, tried to alert the umpire? Was that something that went on quite a bit, as you recall?
Occasionally, but not that often. I think for fans who want to be reminded, or younger fans who didn't live through it, one of the best examples is one of the games that shows up all the time now on the all-time games on the Major League Baseball Network is Game 7 of the 1965 World Series. Played in the daytime because all World Series games were in the daytime then. Ray Scott, the voice of the Twins, splitting the duties with the great Vin Scully. Jim Kaat starts the game against Sandy Koufax, and there's very little stepping out. The stepping out you see is to look for a sign from the third base coach. So by and large, I think the pace that Jim Kaat set was the pace at which that game was played. I'm sure that occasionally, whatever the scouting report might have been on Jim, occasionally there were guys stepping out trying to disrupt his rhythm. But I don't recall that happening all that often. I think they were in sync. Generally speaking, players themselves were in sync with that sort of pace.
Peter, Bob mentions these matchups against Sandy Koufax in the 65 series. Kaat made 3 starts in that series, and each time he was pitted directly against Koufax. He pitches game 2, then he pitches game 5 on short rest. Then he comes back and pitches game 7 on extremely short rest. I mean, this is remarkable. Now, he ends up losing game 7. No shame losing to the great Sandy Koufax. But it tells you something about the respect with which the Twins regarded Kaat, that they would put him directly against Koufax 3 times.
Now, I don't know why Camilo Pascual did not pitch in that series. Because Mudcat Grant, who was the first African-American pitcher for the American black pitcher to ever win 20 games, he had 2 great appearances, plus he had a home run in that series. But it was just Grant and Kaat. And so I'm presuming, looking back, that there was something wrong with Pascual. It was still a very fine pitcher at that time. But still, I mean, there were certain guys you just trusted them, and Kaat was one of those guys. I mean, the 67 that Bob mentioned, he was winning in on the second to last day of the season. He pulled a muscle in his forearm and left the game. Kardashtevsky's always said, we don't win the pennant. There's no impossible dream if Jim Kaat gets to finish that game. So it's just, there was a trust factor with him. And I think because of his nature as a human being, he was always so well trusted. I'm being around the game as long as I have. I really find that there are certain people that teammates look to and say, all right, I want this guy out there. And I think it's very important.
I've never gotten the sense, Peter, that Jim Kaat has ever used short rest as an excuse. He's never said, well, I had to pitch, against Koufax. I didn't have my full rest. He embraced it. He took it as a challenge, and he's never been one for excuse making.
I've never heard anything. I mean,
No.
one of the great things about Jim, I think, and I think Bob would agree, is his joy about the game. I mean, people can't say, "Oh, I love the game more than the play." You can't know Jim Kaat. I mean, a matter of fact, I believe Bob was doing the game with him at Fenway Park a couple of years ago, and we were standing down the left field line at Fenway Park at about 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and he was talking about either his second or third appearance in the major leagues in 1959, and he was talking about he came in the back door at Fenway, was walking down the line, and the joy, he said, I was so excited. I mean, here I'm 19 years old, and I look down, and they're playing Pepper at home plate. Ted Williams, Tom Yorkie, and the clubhouse guy were playing Pepper, and he said, I sat down in the stands and just watched it for 20 minutes, thinking, I can't believe that I'm getting to do this. And I always thought, that's amazing that as a kid out of Northern Michigan, that he had that joy just seeing those guys playing Pepper, and he still recalls it so well. It's just that fun stuff. I mean, when we consider it, I'm amazed by it. It's never stopped. That I went that night and looked it up. Okay, what was his first game? August 2nd, 1959. His first batter he faced was Luis Aparicio. And it was the day that Willie McCovey hit his first home run. I was thinking, Jim Kaat is almost like my whole life of watching baseball. And so it's just listening to him with his stories, and as I say, the Dick Allen stories. It's brought so much to my life in the game. I can't get enough of listening to his stories. And I hope that we have about 4 or 5 days in Cooperstown this summer listening to them.
Peter, you were telling me earlier who his last batter that he retired.
Tony Pena, 1983. Ground ball, shortstop.
Luis Aparicio to Tony Pena, several generations covered there. One of the people that Jim has always made a conscious point of trying to credit when he's on the air or in other situations is his pitching coach with the Minnesota Twins, Johnny Sain. I imagine, Bob, that Jim has talked a lot about Sain's influence, and the sense that I've gotten is that Jim feels he never would have had anything close to this level of success without Sain in his corner.
Yeah, well, of course, he was very successful with the Twins earlier in his career, had a 25-win season in 1966, the year after they went to the World Series. And as Peter mentioned, was putting together a wonderful season in 67 until he had the forearm problem. But when later in the 70s, he finds himself with the White Sox. That's where he spent a whole lot of time with Johnny Sain. Now, philosophies about pitching and with analytics having such an influence have changed tremendously. But Sain's general idea was the more you throw, the longer you can go. Don't baby. Play long toss. Toss between or throw between starts. And they had a period of time, and I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. Maybe Peter remembers it more clearly than I do. But between Wilbur Wood, who was a knuckleballer, and Jim Kaat, who seemed to have a rubber arm, they had guys who take the ball on 2 days rest if it was necessary. We weren't talking about a 5 or even 6-man rotation where normal rest is 5 days between starts. And rewinding to that 65 World Series, people may have learned or may recall that Sandy Koufax couldn't pitch game 1 because it was Yom Kippur. Mm-hmm. And Don Drysdale, no slouch, took the ball in game 1, then Sandy pitched game 2. So ultimately, Sandy and Jim Kaat both pitched game 7 on 2 days rest. And it was only a 2-0 game, and Kaat did not pitch badly. But the Twins, knowing that if you fall behind by 2 runs to Koufax, you might as well be behind by 5 runs to a mere mortal, they went to the bullpen and to pinch hitters earlier in the game. And Koufax pitched a complete game shutout on 2 days rest and had no curveball. After about the 4th or 5th inning, he lost his feel for the curveball. He threw almost entirely fastballs from the 4th or 5th inning on and still threw a shutout.
By the way, Bob, Wilbur Wood in 1973 started 48 games.
There you go. He started basically a third of their games.
Yeah. It's really amazing how his career revived in Chicago. It's hard to believe, but in 1973, the Twins actually released him. The owner, Calvin Griffith, released him, and he was picked up on waivers by the Chicago White Sox late that season. And then in 74 and 75, he really revives his career. He wins over 20 games each time. And it's remarkable because now he's in his mid-30s, supposedly past his prime, supposedly near the end of the line. Talk about Chuck Tanner and how much, I guess, he liked pitching for Tanner. Let's start with Peter.
He really liked Tanner. Tanner really liked him. I mean, Chuck was he was very tough. I saw him. I'm trying to remember. It was Carlos May. Somebody. I remember he walked out to left field one day at a game at Fenway Park and pulled. I think it was Carlos May out of the game. But he was also really good to play for. He trusted, and I mean, he let Kaat. Jim didn't have to be there at 6 o'clock in the morning in spring training. I mean, he had his own training schedule. He did a lot of things. He and Dick Allen like to go. They both love the horses, and I don't mean gambling. I mean just the raising of horses, which of course Dick later became the first African American to have a horse in the Kentucky Derby. But he really trusted. He trusted Tanner, and Tanner trusted him, and those starting pitchers. I mean, he was bringing along. Gossage and Forster were coming along with the White Sox at that time, but still, it was a starting pitching team. I mean, that one year when Wood started, Stan Bonson started about 35 or 40 games too. So you knew with Chuck Tanner that there would be a tomorrow if today didn't work.
Let me just jump in with this, Bruce, because I know that everyone who's on this Zoom or broadcast or whatever we're calling it, everyone who would take the time and be interested in this is a true baseball fan and a fan of baseball history. And Peter just mentioned Terry Forster. Go to Baseball Reference. Skip past Terry Forster's pitching exploits, which were considerable. Look at him as a hitter. Now, part of his career he spends in a DH league. The rest of it, by and large, sometimes he was a starter, but then eventually became a relief specialist. So there were seasons where he only got 15, 16 at-bats. There were seasons where he got no at-bats. He has a lifetime batting average way over 300. He had several seasons where, admittedly, in limited at-bats, he hit over 400. I think I was on with Tom Verducci once about a year ago, and somehow Forster's name came up. And I calculated that were it not for the last couple of seasons of his career, where he might have gone, I don't know, 2 for 20 in those 2 seasons, he would have had a lifetime batting average over 400, which is one of those weird baseball oddities. I don't know what Terry Forster would have hit if you made him a DH and you gave him 300 at bats. Maybe he hit 150. But over the course of his career, he was raking in the few limited at bats that he got.
I never would have thought that with Forster, because he was not exactly known for, his highly trained conditioning. He got a rather unflattering nickname
David
later in
Letterman.
his career.
David Letterman, sometime in the 80s, had a running thing about Terry Forster. So I'm only quoting Letterman here. He kept referring to him as, I'm watching the Braves game. This is when the superstations first started. I'm watching the Braves on TBS. And who is this tub of goo, Terry Forster? But Forster had a good sense of humor about it and eventually came on the show with Letterman.
Interesting. Forster, very good hitting pitcher. Jim Kaat had a pretty good reputation as a hitting pitcher. His 1973 Topps card, intriguingly, features him at bat for the Minnesota Twins. That's something you don't often see on a pitcher's card. But the thing that Jim was really known for, beside his pitching, was his fielding. This is a great photo that was taken by the Sporting News, must have been around 1976. Jim won 16 Gold Gloves. 12 of them, I believe, are on display here. I want to get both of your reaction to seeing a wonderful, we don't see photographs like this where they make such an effort to stage it, but it does tell you something about another aspect of Jim's career.
Yeah, he had the 16 Gold Gloves and also hit 16 lifetime homers for symmetry's sake. Pretty good hitter, occasionally used as a pinch hitter.
Yeah, and, I don't know what the rack is that they found to put all these gloves on. I don't know if it was specially designed for this, but this really took quite a bit of effort to choreograph this. You remember this publicity photo for the Sporting News, Peter?
I do remember it because I believe at that time I was actually writing for the Sporting News. But Jim played a lot. He was a great athlete. He played a lot of pepper, and that's one of the things in the game that unfortunately is out. I thought it really helped so many, particularly pitchers. When I was actually covering for the Boston Globe and used to go out in early afternoons every day on the road, I used to participate in pepper games with Tom Bergmeyer, Bill Campbell, a couple of other guys who were all killers. They loved it. The big game was how many times they could hit my shins. But they learned, and I remember Bergmeyer, who was a great fielder, said basically it was watching Jim Kaat and knowing what his practice regime was. That's what he did. How much he relied on playing pepper all the time. And as I say, great fielding pitchers do make a great deal of difference. They really help themselves. They spread the second baseman and the shortstop out, and I think that has a lot to do with it. Maybe that's why he remembers seeing Ted Williams and Tom Yawkey play pepper.
Hey,
Jim
Bruce,
is 6'4" and remarkably nimble, and also had a great pickoff move. That was also part of his defensive repertoire. Yeah, Bob, go right ahead.
Well, to your point, Bruce, he was and remains a really good all-round athlete. He's in his mid-80s now, plays golf all the time, rides his bike. He's in tremendous physical shape for a man of his age. And I don't know, 8-9 years ago, he shot his age or better, bested or equaled his age, both left-handed and right-handed on the golf course. So let's say he was 78 years old. He shot 78 or better on consecutive days, once right-handed and once left-handed. And just to back up what I said about Terry Forster, I took a quick look at Baseball Reference while Peter was speaking. This is an amazing oddity. He had over a 16-year career, 86 plate appearances, 78 official at-bats, 31 for 78. His lifetime batting average is .397. And had he not gone, let's see, 0 for 4 for the 1985 Braves, he would have finished over 400 lifetime.
Wow. You talk about the conditioning of Jim Kaat. He's traded to the Phillies after the 1975 season. This is a photograph of him in 76. You can see the Liberty Bell on the left sleeve of the Phillies uniform, which they wore during that season. In this photograph, this is hard to believe, he is 37 years of age. He looks like he's about 27. I mean, he does not look like your typical 37-year-old.
No, he was always extraordinarily fit, which is why he was able to pitch into his mid-40s. And also because he was never overpowering. So it wasn't a severe transition when they say, well, the guy's reached the point of his career, he's got to rely on craft or on guile. That was always an aspect of what he did. So that and his willingness to fulfill any role. He pitched in almost 900 games. I just checked this out earlier today. 898 games, 625 as a starter. So those assignments out of the bullpen were varied. Occasionally he closed games. Often he was a long man or a middle man. And toward the end, he wasn't too proud to say, okay, we're losing 9-1 and you need someone to just mop up some innings. Give me the ball. I'll do that too.
Jim's repertoire was varied. He threw a sinking fastball, slider. They were maybe his two best pitches. He would also mix in curveballs, had remarkable control. As Bob said, not overpowering. Peter, I know for much of his career, we did not have radar gun readings that were as prevalent as they are today. If you were to guess what his best fastball was, what do you think? High 80s, 90, or am I overestimating it?
No, I would guess it would be probably 89 to about 93. I mean, in that area. But he had such great control. He's such a great athlete, as Bob said. And he was really good at reading hitters. I mean, that's so much of an underrated aspect to great pitchers is being able to look at a hitter and see what the hitter is thinking. And Maddox could always do that. Pedro Martinez was a master of that. And he was way ahead of his time that way. He read hitters and went after them. And I go back to Yastrzemski talking about it was for Yaz, who was a pretty good player. I mean, Kaat was one of the toughest pitchers for him to hit. Could never absolutely hit him at all. And that game that he went out when Kaat left after 3 innings, I don't remember the pitcher's name from Minnesota, but they had a left-handed pitcher who came in relief and gave up, I believe it was a 3-run homer to Yastrzemski, which led them to the final day and winning the division, winning the pennant.
Was it Jim Merritt, Pete?
I think it might have been. Yes.
Very good memory.
Wow.
Let's talk about Jim as a broadcaster. And while that doesn't have anything to do with his election of the Hall of Fame, it's certainly a significant part of his career. He started broadcasting in the late 1980s, joined the Yankee crew for a number of years, went to Minnesota to broadcast. Of course, in more recent years, he's been doing work on the MLB network. Bob, you've obviously had a chance to work with him a lot in recent years, and those broadcasts are always special fun for me. I grew up with baseball in the 70s, so I love the stories from the old days, just like I like the game today. What is he like as a broadcast partner?
He's a great partner. He's a good audience, and people underestimate that in a partner. It isn't, some people are, even if they're nice guys, they're waiting for you to finish and then they're going to make their point. You have to go where your partner takes you. If Jim starts on a story, I'm interested in it. I try and follow up. If there's anything to add, you try and tie a ribbon around it. If I say something funny, Jim's a good audience for it. So there's a comfort level there. We've known each other for so long. It isn't like, what are we going to do here? Here's what we're going to do in the second inning. In the fifth inning, no, we just sit down and we do it. And we know that we can trust each other. Our connection to the game is similar. He's older than I am, but not so much older that the era of baseball in which he excelled is an era in which I'm following it as a kid. His broadcast career, Bruce, has allowed him to be uninterrupted, an 8-decade man. He breaks in with the Senators in 1959. After his 25-year playing career, he's a coach for Pete Rose. When Pete was managing the Reds, Jim was their pitching coach. And then he's never missed a season when he was not calling Major League Baseball since then. So uninterrupted from 1959 until 2022, and assuming they play baseball this year, he will again do at least a handful of games with me on the Major League Baseball Network.
Does he ever get tired in the booth, especially with these 4-hour games?
He doesn't like the 4-hour games. It really irks him to whatever extent a man as genial as Jim can be irked. He doesn't like it, and he makes that clear, but not in an angry way. He just makes his points as we go along. And if we get a game that lasts 220, the occasional game that lasts 220, that's always part of the wrap-up. And we know Jim Kaat enjoyed this one. It went just 2 hours and 20 minutes, and there must be some eateries open around town. So let's get out of here. Thanks for joining us. Good night, everybody.
Yeah. Peter, you've worked with him as well, going back to your days at ESPN. That's maybe something a lot of people are not aware of. What is it in particular that makes Jim so good as an analyst, so good as a part of the broadcast booth?
His passion for the game, that he's never lost. He's never sat there and go, oh, in my day. I've never heard him say, no, he'll talk about how different things might have been in his time, but he's never been, oh, it was better then than it is now. There are some things, obviously, that rankle him at times, but we all have that from any age. But it's that he's forever in the game and thinking about, okay, this is what I think about in this situation or that situation. I mean, it's, and there's nothing, he's never programmed when he goes out there. He hasn't thought out, well, this is what I'm going to say. He doesn't have little cards that tell him, I'm going to say this or say that. I mean, it's so good. I mean, Bob doesn't mind. I was doing a thing on what I thought was the best game I ever saw in the postseason pitched. And I immediately said the fourth game of the 2000 playoffs, Roger Clemens in Seattle. And so MLB Network had me do something on it. So I went back and watched the whole game. And I was struck by the fact that Bob and Joe Morgan, there was a trust that Joe Morgan had in Bob, and to be, not because Bob's here, it was one of the best broadcast games I've ever watched. I've watched it about 4 times since. Plus, wow. Clemens, having been there for Clemens' first starts and so forth, it was a fascinating game to see. But there was nothing pre-scripted about that game. And there was a lot that went on because Clemens had struggled going into that game. And Jim comes to the ballpark, and today's a different game, and that's what it is. And that's what Joe liked. And when Joe was told, this is the script for this game, Joe could rebel a little bit, to say the least.
Yeah. Joe would bristle at that. What you just said, though, reminds me of one of Jim Kaat's favorite sayings, and I guess it applies to broadcasting as much as the way he viewed the game. He will often say, you study long, you study wrong. Now, obviously, it's a generational thing, but he feels that sometimes he'll say, this guy has scouting report-itis. He can't think for himself at the mound or at the plate. He's running through his head. What is he going to throw me on 2-1 because this is what the scouting report tells me. And he feels that, well, I know you feel the same way, Peter. The analytics are indispensable. They've improved our understanding of the game, no matter how long we've been around it. They're essential for building a team and making decisions about personnel, including in-game decisions. But there's something to be said for Jim's point. Joe Torre put it another way when he said to Brian Cash, remember, this game has a heartbeat. And if you take the spontaneity out of it or the sense of the moment out of it, a guy takes off his cap and he's looking inside his cap as to what I should be throwing this guy in this moment. Well, this is a new day. It's a day unto itself. Maybe your fastball is working better than your breaking ball. Maybe you just need to have a sense of it instead of having it scripted. And that's part of Jim's point. You study long, you study wrong.
That's why he loved Mark Burley. Mark Burley,
Oh, yeah.
he won over 200 games and claimed that A, he never shook off a sign, and B, never read a scouting report. He just executed what the catcher put down for all those years. And that's what Chris Sale does today. I mean, and for certain people, that's a very effective way to pitch.
Here we have a great photo of Bob and Jim together on the MLB Network. Bob, assuming that we have a fairly normal season, and as an optimist, I'm going to hold that line as best I can. How many games do you think you and Jim will do this year, approximately?
Just a guess, 8, 10, maybe half a dozen, depending upon if the season is truncated. Jim lives in Vermont during the season, so we tend to plug him into any games at Fenway and games in New York. But here's the thing. If he finds out he's doing a game on Tuesday night, he doesn't have to obsess all weekend long about whatever data may be coming over the transom. He's got it. He's good.
Can I convince you guys to increase the workload to once a week? Is that possible?
You know what? As long as they didn't have to fly cross country, Jim's in his mid 80s. I'm going to be 70 by opening day. I think it's a young 70, but I don't know that I want to be crisscrossing. I'm watching what Mike Tirico is doing now as we speak. And I used to do whatever the equivalent was. In effect, Mike has succeeded me in many of those roles at NBC. And he's flying from Beijing to Stamford, Connecticut, and then from Stamford, Connecticut to Los Angeles to host the Super Bowl, and all the jet lag factored in. And I remember when I used to do that, when I went from the NBA to baseball, from baseball to the Olympics, back to baseball for the postseason, all in the space of a few weeks and months. I'm glad I did it, but there comes a time when that's, in your rearview mirror. And, I think I'm at a point, and Jim may be too. Think of a guy who's toward the end of his NBA career, and he can be just as good for 20 minutes as he used to be for 40 minutes. But if you play him 30, the production starts to go down per minute. So I think I'm, I don't need as many now mixed sports. I don't need as many at bats. If my batting average is going to be equal to my lifetime batting average, I need fewer at bats.
Yeah, I'm thinking Bill Walton with the Celtics in the late 80s. That could be
That's
the
great.
role.
Yeah. Perfect.
As we get set to wrap things up, and it's been a real joy for me to talk to both Bob Costas and Peter Gammons, wanted to look ahead toward Hall of Fame weekend. It is the weekend of July 22nd through the 24th. The induction ceremony is Sunday, July 24th at the Clark Sports Center. I know it's still several months away, but I wanted to ask both of you if you think you'll be able to make it to this year's ceremony. Let's start with Bob.
I am absolutely going to make it. And Jim Kaat is among the many reasons. Jim came to Cooperstown in 2018 with his wife, Margie, for my induction, and I will absolutely be there for his.
That's great. Peter, how about you? Do you think you'll be able to make it?
I will definitely be there, and hopefully we'll have a terrific forum the day after. I mean, I naturally look forward to David Ortiz. Tony Oliva is just one of my favorite characters over the years. And on the Saturday, it's a very important day for me to have Tim Kirchin honored in Cooperstown.
Of course.
And that we were the original trio. Jason Stark, Tim Kirchin, and I were almost like Ted Williams teammates. We go back a long way, and it's be a very important thing, just as it was for Jason 2 years ago.
Now, all three of you are now Writers Wing of the Baseball Hall of Fame. So how wonderful is that? It just occurs to me because Peter mentioned that trio. A few days after my ceremony, and certainly the ceremony wasn't just for me, but the ceremony that I was part of in 2018, I was doing a game on the Baseball Network with John Smoltz. And Smoltz was talking about watching NBC baseball before he broke into the major leagues. And it occurred to me that there was a time when the broadcasters at NBC doing baseball were Vin Scully, Joe Garagiola, Dick Enberg, Tony Kubek, and me. And all five of us wound up in the broadcasters wing of the Baseball Hall of Fame. That's pretty darn good.
Yeah.
Pretty lucky, but also pretty good.
I could spend an hour with you, Bob, just talking about Tony Kubek, one of my broadcasting heroes as well, but we'll have to save that perhaps for another time. Again, the induction weekend coming up July 22nd through the 24th here in Cooperstown. Someone was asking on the chat, will we have a Hall of Fame Classic, essentially a Legends game, an old timers game? Yes, that is going to return after a 2-year absence, and that will take place Memorial Day weekend here in Cooperstown. Bob, Peter, I want to thank you very much. It's been wonderful talking to you over these last 60 minutes or so about Jim Kaat, one of our new members, Hall of Fame class of 2022. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Bruce. In closing, I would just say this. If Jim had not made it as a player, I always thought that he could have been in line for sort of a lifetime achievement thing. The idea of the Buck O'Neill Award, who's been a great citizen of the game. When you think of Jim Kaat's life in baseball, as a player, as a coach, as a broadcaster, as an ambassador, as someone who has touched so many people in baseball with his good nature, he has been a true great citizen of the game. And I don't know anybody in baseball that doesn't feel really wonderful about the fact that he's going to go into the Hall of Fame this summer.
You know, Bob, it's possible that he could win the Frick Award. Being in the Hall of Fame will not exclude him from that possibility. So that might happen too.
Yep, could. He's on the ballot.
Yeah. Dizzy Dean has been another name mentioned in that category. Ralph Kiner, Phil Rizzuto, just a few. It hasn't happened yet, but could happen down the line. Bob, Peter, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. We thank you for being part of Virtual Voices of the Game here in Cooperstown. We thank all the listeners as well. Hope you enjoyed the program. Have a great day, everybody. Take care.